one.
Hello, boys and girls, and welcome to the pre-show for Inside Movies Galore
I
and
Delusions of Grandeur.
Delusions of Grandeur, also also known as Delusions of Grandeur. Tonight's film is David Lynch's 1980 criminally underrated masterpiece, The Elephant Man, starring Anthony Hopkins and John Hurt, yes, and
Mm-hmm.
with Anne Bancroft as well,
Mm-hmm.
um, with an uncredited producer credit from Mel Brooks, and
The Mr. Anne Bancroft.
that that's right.
There, there is a
Yes.
Yeah,
theory that Mel Brooks is kind of a godfather of horror.
well, I
So
mean,
Yeah.
one of the not to get too far ahead of ourselves, but one of the
Mm-hmm.
little things that you will notice is it would have been 6 years before this. Mel Brooks wrote and directed Young Frankenstein, which,
Yes.
despite it being a comedy and a spoof, it did a surprising amount of thorough research and faithful
Mm-hmm.
recreations of
Mm-hmm.
the 30s Frankenstein films and other homages to like Fritz
Mm-hmm.
Lang and things like that. So I mean, even though it's a comedy, like it fits it in that world really well.
It's remarkably good.
mhm.
Yeah. And
Well,
another thing that,
go ahead.
well, I was going to say another time, I was surprised. I did not realize it was a Brooks Films production. And, but
The Fly
one
was
of
too.
one of the other regulars of his productions involved in this one, the music was by the composer who did the music for Blazing Saddles and the producers and
And Young
Spaceballs
Frankenstein.
and yeah, and I don't remember his name offhand. I need to bring
John
up this.
Morris.
Yes, yes.
Yeah,
So
the
that
music in
was
this was incredible.
it is really good.
Well, well, not to get too far afield, who wants to start with their first time with this film?
um, well, I know that my first time was quite some time ago. In fact, um, because I was kind of an '80s child. I grew up. I was born in 1984, so growing up in the late '80s, I would probably catch bits and pieces of this, but it was after I had seen Eraserhead for the first time that I went
Mm.
and looked um, looked up the credits that David Lynch had, and I watched this because I knew it was based on a true story. And rewatching I mean, it is kind of a sad tale in a sense, because it is kind of haunting, especially
Kind
when
of.
it is a
Mhm.
lot, especially when he gets kidnapped by his original captor,
Mhm.
and comes back into the world, and people are attacking him, kind of, well, basically, and
Mhm.
he just wants them to know that you know he is human. He's more than just the freak that he
Mhm.
seems to be. So,
Mhm.
but I
Absolutely.
enjoyed this film. It is kind of um, kind of human to see that the tale of this man who had all these deformities on him, and I think they did a fantastic job with the makeup department on this film, and I think because of um, the lady in the radiator, and the makeup on her, in Eraserhead. I think because of the experience there, is how and why it was so incredible in this film. So, and I really enjoyed
well,
it.
and the outrage from the fact that the Academy didn't give it any kind of makeup Oscar, which to be
Yeah.
fair, they didn't have a formal category yet. But
Right.
just the fact that it didn't get any kind of honorary Oscar or whatever, that led to the creation of the best makeup category,
Mhm.
which makes perfect sense.
Anyone else?
Were you gonna continue there? Well, what about you, Jake?
Well, somewhat similarly, I kind of looked this up initially after becoming introduced to David Lynch. I still have not seen all of Eraserhead. I know Brandon and I started it once and got through like 3 minutes of it. one day. But I believe my initial introduction was actually Mulholland Drive. And this may have been the second, third, or fourth one I came to. I know Blue Velvet was in there somewhere. But I was fascinated by Mulholland Drive, and I wanted to see more by this person. And Elephant Man is an oddity in his. This is, I think, only my second time, maybe third time watching this. Probably third time, because I think I watched it after getting it, and I think I watched it before getting it. So this is probably my third time. But it's been years.
Because I think this was my third time too.
Yeah.
So,
but I think I have seen. I have not yet seen Eraserhead or Dune or Lost Highway. There's a few that I still need to see, but of the several I have, this one to me. Fittingly enough, he has a movie that fittingly enough called The Straight Story. To me, the two are the most straightforward films that he has done. They're both very human tales about people who were a little bit different. In this case, a lot different. And it has a lot of that what you might call trademark Lynch flair to it. But it does have echoes of Young Frankenstein, and it does have echoes of. I mean, you have not just Anthony Hopkins, but Sir John Gielgud. You've got, again, John Hurt. You've got some really, really, really high-profile acting talent in this film. So it also has sort of an old school kind of, Victorian period drama. I mean, really. So there's a lot to it that gives it its own unique vibe. That music definitely helps give it that, But I have always liked the film. I think it's a really, really well done film. It's not the easiest one to watch, but it's very interesting.
Brandon?
Well, this actually is my first watch. So, I mean, I was first looking at, I first heard about it when I was trying to do some Oscar hunting, because one of my goals is to eventually try and get every Oscar winner. And though it didn't win any Oscars, it was certainly nominated for quite a number of them.
It's criminal that it didn't win anything.
Yeah, it was still 8 Oscar nominations was quite an amazing feat in of itself. And I was introduced to David Lynch through a couple of films, but of course, one of them I did see Eraserhead all the way through, which was fairly different from this as far as structurally and all that. But I had been meaning to see this for many years. So I ordered that 4K, and it's still in customs. So we'll get to see it in 4K. And because it is one that I would like to see as clear as possible. But
it looks beautiful, so you'll be in for a good time.
But definitely touched on tones, things that have already been in our existence and in society, as far as themes, lines. I mean, that last speech he made when he was being attacked by the crowd, that's regularly echoed in media and current day. So it's just to me, it's great to be able to see it and hit those notes each time. So I felt really good when I saw it the first time through.
Well, this I watched it right before this. I finished it in 4K with that beautiful Studio Canal Zavi exclusive steelbook, and it's well worth it. Not 4K in the United States yet, for
Yeah.
whatever reason, and not released by the Criterion Collection for reasons I will never understand. But I saw with David Lynch, my first experience of his was Lost Highway, and I saw that when I was like at maybe 15 or so. And then after that, like Eraserhead, Mulholland Drive, things like that. And then I did watch The Elephant Man in college, and well, coming off the heels of Eraserhead, this was a very good kind of logical next step for him in his career because visually it owes a lot to his experience on Eraserhead, and it has a lot of similar kind of industrial audio kind of sounds and some surrealistic dream sequences and things like that. The difference is that with this film, it's grounded by an exceptionally well written script, and anchored by the fact that it was a real story and probably one of the most heartbreaking to ever exist. It's significant for me on a lot of levels, and I'll get into it later. But it was the first film that I ever saw that actually made me cry, because there were like a select few films that I got a little teary eyed at, but I never actually cried. But then I was like maybe 20 when I watched this, and it was on either DVD or VHS. I rented it from the student library and watched it, and upon watching it again this time, the same two parts that always got me again. The first of which was the when he's talking about his mother, how he thinks he would have been a great disappointment to her, and then the second time was when he's visited by Anne Bancroft, and he's the picture that she gives him, and he says, "I'll put it here in a place of honor next to my mother." And for whatever reason, those two moments always got me. And I think it goes. This film's my number two, and then City Lights is my number one favorite film of all time. But they go together very well thematically, and one of the connection points is that they're both about people who are not appreciated by society for some reason or another. The Elephant Man because of his deformities, and the Little Tramp because of his being, homeless vagabond, and being kind of accident prone. But I think the thing that makes this film special is that, from what I've researced, they got the facts from two separate books, one of which was the doctor that Anthony Hopkins plays, hit the book that he wrote, and then a later book that was written by a historian. It would have been like the newest info about him that was known at the time. So they collated those two sources to create this narrative. And the things that happened, they did happen. I don't think they really had to make anything up for this. And I mean, that's the thing, the real story of Joseph Merrick, who there's a whole big controversy because in the doctor's book he calls him John Merrick, and for a long time people thought that was what his name was, but it was actually Joseph Merrick. But his real life was so unimaginably tragic and yet so profoundly full of hope, and I think the movie shows that pretty remarkably. And it's something that even beyond just the emotional aspect, I mean, the artistry employed in the film is unbelievable because the black and white cinematography is just perfect. The recreation of Victorian London, especially the Whitechapel area, is faithfully recreated. And this was something that I didn't connect the two at the time because I hadn't really delved into Jack the Ripper yet. But I did later on when I read Alan Moore's and Eddie Campbell's graphic novel From Hell. And in that graphic novel, Alan Moore like exhaustively researched not just Jack the Ripper, but researched all about the 1880s. And so that story was more about how the Jack the Ripper murders reflected their times and the times in which they occurred. And in that graphic novel, the antagonist, the person that is revealed to in the story to have been Jack the Ripper, but of course, there's no proof that he was. But he actually meets Joseph Merrick, and even though it's a graphic novel, like they recreate his kind of his bronchitis, his kind of lip that made it hard for him to make certain sounds, and they recreate that very faithfully. But it's just interesting to think that Joseph Merrick, the Elephant Man, and Jack the Ripper were coexisting in the same place at the same time. And so you had, and it's, again, this isn't about Jack the Ripper, but it's like you see the setting that could create someone like that, but then you also see what kind of amazing triumph of the human spirit could come out of a horrible place like that, because you had very faithfully recreated. You had prostitutes. You had the very early stages of the Industrial Revolution with no thought to the environment whatsoever. All of London being filled with unbelievably foul black smoke and coal and dirty streets and all that stuff. I mean, they recreate that very faithfully, and even though, again, it's not a Jack the Ripper film, you could easily see why that environment could create someone like that, but then also how inspiring it is when someone like the Elephant Man comes along and is able to find some sense of dignity amidst all of that. But I think it's one of David Lynch's few really grounded films. Like, but I think honestly, and I find it funny because like that's one of his most kind of quote unquote normal films. And yet it's easily my favorite of his, even though it is kind of an outlier for the rest of his career. But I think what it shows is that you can marry that amazing sense of visual artistry with yeah, and some surrealism and things like that, things that someone else wouldn't do. You can marry that with a really really well written script, and and it's also worth noting that this was an early successful film for Anthony Hopkins, who was not a household name at the time, although he had been in some well-known films like The Lion in Winter before that. But he was not a household name. He was not at all a megastar. He was a very well-accomplished, very well-trained actor on the London stage. And, so he was not at all a newbie, but this was just an early kind of feather in his cap. And yet it took 11 more years for him to achieve mainstream, breakout superstardom with Silence of the Lambs. And his performance in this film was what got him the role of Hannibal Lecter, because the idea was what if the good doctor went horribly wrong one day? And and I think that that's a really good observation, because this film is all about kind of the opposite ends of the human behavioral emotional spectrum. You've got unbelievable sadism and cruelty on the one end, and then you've got unbelievable kindness and generosity and compassion on the other. and Anthony Hopkins is able to, well, in this film he's the compassionate good doctor, and then of course in Hannibal Lecter he plays the opposite. But that's a fitting observation, and I think the film really does show you a good cross section of humanity and what people are really made of when they're confronted with something that is different than what they're used to. And it's fair to say that the Elephant Man was something that people of his time and place were certainly not used to, and even still today, because there are very, very few people in history that have ever been remotely close to that. And I think as far as his exact condition, which to this day we're still not 100% sure exactly what it was. There's a couple different theories on that, but they're still not 100% sure what his exact medical condition was. And so yeah, he would most certainly stand out even today. And it's a remarkably human story, and it just shows. It has a personal connection with me because, like, if you grew up, like I was homeschooled, and I, had a lot of health problems and a lot of things that made it very difficult for me to live a normal life, and still to this day kind of do. But it's like when you grow up that way and you are kind of sequestered from other people and in many ways, and when you feel like you're kind of trapped in your own body, then the one place that you're free, more or less, is in your own imagination. And you can definitely see some of that with Joseph Merrick there, because he creates his model of the cathedral, and he has an appreciation for art and for the kind of aspirational things in life. He has a very, and the real man had this too. He had a very strong Christian faith and a very strong kind of sense that he, in spite of his deformities, that he still had value. And it's
actually,
I think that's, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that leads to one of the more, what I think is one of the standout scenes in the film. Is at one point earlier, you see someone comments on his lack of response, and Treves, was it Frederick or William? I can't remember, but Dr. Treves, Frederick Treves, Hopkins' character, he's an idiot, an imbecile. At least I pray to God he is. And then like later, he's trying to look good for the head doctor, Mr. Corgom, which I find that very interesting. That he's always referred with a full address, or Cargom rather, which is John Gielgud again. And he comes in, and Hopkins has coached him about what he needs to do, what have you. And you see their rehearsal beforehand, but then basically Gom is like, okay, it's nice to meet you, and leaves, and he's basically taking Treves to task. You obviously coached him, and all the while back in the back, like they had planned, he has started reciting Psalm 23, and he gets through the part that they coached, they did, and then he just keeps going, and all of a sudden, Treves puts his hands up, and he's like, wait a minute. And he goes to the door, and he's like, I didn't teach him that. And so, then they're both like, oh. And then he's like, oh, well, I was just scared. I didn't want to talk because I was scared. It was like, but that's just that moment where they have that big epiphany about, well, he's not an idiot. He is an intelligent individual. I always thought that was a really fun, well, very, very interesting scene. Very,
very powerful. I mean, because honestly, like making the Young Frankenstein connection there, which again, Young Frankenstein it's a spoof, and yet it did its
Mhm.
homework with paying homage
Mhm.
to the James Whale Universal Frankenstein
Mhm.
legacy and the original book and everything. So it even though it was a spoof, like it fit in that world remarkably well. But the speaking of that connection, the if you've ever read the Frankenstein book, which is my favorite novel of all time, the monster in there is well, it doesn't start off this way, but like he gets this way. He becomes well, he can't speak initially, but like he becomes incredibly well spoken and eloquent and highly intelligent, highly empathetic, highly insightful. um,
Mhm.
and that was always something that the Universal films never really got to, and that's why I can't ever, like, when I think of Frankenstein in my head, it's like that's like the popular interpretation of it, but
Mhm.
that's not what Frankenstein means to me. Except here with the Elephant Man, well, the connection's very close in terms of um, the fact that they look very similar. They have Mel Brooks as a linking force, but then also you have a deformed person that is reviled by the people that see him, and yet he has a soul, he has the ability to express himself, and he has more of a love for beauty and life, and you know
Mhm.
that sort of thing than a lot of people that he's surrounded with and surrounded by. And I think it is a very powerful scene. I think
Mhm.
part of why those two scenes in the middle, part of why I think they always got to me was because by that point in the film, they've done all the right things story wise. They've set up this person, this creature, essentially. They've set this creature up. You don't really see much of him. You don't, gradually you see more of him, and he's still not speaking. There's a tremendous amount of buildup with the mask that he wears.
Mhm.
And so then by the time that you get to him having some rudimentary speech, which I'm sure part of why he didn't speak before, on top of being scared and
Mhm.
everything, he probably, because of his chronic bronchitis,
Right.
I am sure that he probably, yeah, I'm sure speaking was probably kind of painful, and he probably
Yeah.
hadn't done much of it in a long time, so he kind of had to warm up the old vocal cords again.
Right.
So I mean, I imagine that was part of it, because you notice that once he gets going, as he
Mhm.
speaks more and more, he sounds fine.
Well,
But again, I think that's because he got back
And,
into the rhythm of it, because
well, that
you
apparently,
try not speaking for years and imagine how you would sound.
and that apparently was a change from the original because he was relatively, even though he spoke very quietly with that sort
Mhm.
of sucking noise as part of it. Uh,
Yeah, and
he
that one side of his mouth doesn't quite
right.
open up all the way.
But apparently, in real life, John Merrick or Joseph Merrick was very. It was very difficult to understand him. He apparently could not speak very well at all, but he could speak. It's just physically very, very difficult. So I think
Well,
they
and
changed that
and John Hurt,
slightly. Hmm?
yeah, well,
They
just a
probably
little
changed
bit,
it
but like,
slightly just for to make it so they didn't have to subtitle him or something like that. You know.
oh yeah, but I
Yeah.
mean, John Hurt, to his amazing credit,
Yes.
not only does he act his ass off underneath what
Right.
I am sure is pounds and pounds of makeup.
Oh, it was.
Not only that, but like, he does manage to evoke that feeling,
Mhm.
even though, like you said, he is more articulate than perhaps the real person was, and yet
Mhm.
you do hear the,
Mhm.
you hear that, and
sucking.
especially with,
Yeah.
yeah, well, because he's got all kinds of mucus and stuff,
Mhm.
and the fact that the makeup, they
Yeah.
do make the one side of his mouth not
Mhm.
fully come out. It's the combination of those two things.
Mhm.
They do a good enough job of evoking it, and I mean, well, we have photographic evidence of what the real man looked like, and we have his skeleton still.
Mhm.
I
Which
don't know if I don't know if we have any audio recordings of him to
no,
confirm that.
Oh,
I didn't think so.
not from back
Um,
then.
I think
mm-mm.
in 2003 they did take a bone sample analysis,
Yeah.
and they were trying to figure out what he exactly died of. But
Right.
it was
Oh, they knew what he died of. They were trying to figure out what his condition was.
Right.
Because what he died of was, well, what happened in the movie. His head is so massive relative to what his neck could support that
Mhm.
his neck basically broke, and he asphyxiated,
well, yeah,
because he couldn't get back up. But then with
his neck
that
was
that test.
dislocated.
Yeah, that test that you're saying, they were trying to, because they did find a distant relative of his, and they were trying to match up the DNA to try and get a sense of what his
Mm.
condition might have been, because
Mm.
um, apparently the real Joseph Merrick, apparently, I believe that his mother was in fact beautiful, but I do think she had some kind of genetic deformity of some kind that she clearly must have passed on to her son. Um, and apparently, in real life, he was born totally normal looking, and around age, like gradually, these deformities presented
Mhm.
themselves, and I think like they started to take really full effect when he was about like 5 or so.
Mm.
um like as far as like the skin becoming the tumors and the growths and all that stuff.
Right.
um and of course the curvature of the spine and the fact that his one arm wouldn't work and things like that.
Mhm.
um it was, again, no one really knows exactly what it was, and I doubt we
Mhm.
ever necessarily will. It's a little bit like, again, contemporary of his, Jack the Ripper. It's like we have plenty of evidence, and yet we don't have enough to really make a conclusive match, and we probably never will,
Right.
because all the people involved are long dead, and there wasn't like
Mhm.
the collection of evidence in the way that we do it today. Same with medical records, obviously, with which, and you got to love also the recreation of what late 1800s medicine was like, not only in the surgical situations with, you know, you got people that clearly don't have scrubs on. They probably not washed as thoroughly as we would wash
Right.
today. Um, and then you also have the old lecture hall, the way that those looked, and the kinds of like
Mhm.
demonstrations that they would do. And, it's all men who are attending these classes. And, you know, the initial presentation of the Elephant Man, it does kind of walk that fine line between, freak show and scientific anomaly. Which
Mhm.
you never get the sense that the doctor is exploiting him, but you get the sense that he kind of has a scientific curiosity and a scientific kind of
Mhm.
excitement in a way, which in and of itself can be kind of exploitive without necessarily meaning to be. But
Of course,
because he's
he does come to
There,
question. Yeah.
oh
yeah,
yeah.
there is
Mhm.
a moment where he sees him for the first time, and he
Mhm.
Mm,
and he literally, you can see that he is emotional at,
Mhm.
at the sight of him for the first time.
Mhm.
I had the feeling that David Lynch was trying to emit an emotion from Hopkins to portray him as being this man who is standing here, seeing a beauty in his eyes,
Mhm.
such beauty to the scientific mind.
mhm.
Mhm.
To me, um, that was kind of a cool moment.
Oh
Right.
yeah, that was very powerful, because that you don't, like, you see some people cry in this. It's not that often, but like when people do, it's very significant, and it's not done in any kind of over dramatic way. Like it's very restrained, and like people are clearly trying not to, and yet the emotions flow out quite literally. The with him, it's like, and it's a fairly long take on, fairly long close up on Anthony Hopkins. And you see his eyes like go from a place of no tears to welling up with tears to having the perfectly timed, two streaks coming down. It's like, that, and his expression conveys so much as far as like fascination, horror, pity, I don't know what I'm looking at, kind of all of those things kind of all in one expression. It's remarkable. And I mean, you can see why he and John Hurt and John Gielgud, and why these people are like the creme de la creme of their time.
Well, like as we I know Brandon loves to do this, and I like to do this too. Speaking of John Hurt, brings back to his wonderful line of the where he's talking about from Hopkins' vantage point here. He is seeing this terrible thing, but great. It's absolutely horrifying, but also great. But one of my favorite moments is along those lines. Of all the meetings, like there's a lot of meetings in this movie. And like you mentioned, a lot of people have different reactions, and the reactions are usually important. Probably to me, the best one, and this involves, let's see, her name is Hannah Gordon. She plays the Mrs. Treves, the doctor's wife.
She was fantastic.
Yes, he invites Merrick home for tea. And she greets him politely, and he starts crying. And then it just freaks her out. And he's like, I've never been treated so well by a beautiful woman. And she just doesn't know what to do with that. She is completely, and like you said, she did a fantastic job with that.
And to be fair, it's like when you're in her shoes, or really in anybody's shoes, it's like, what do you say or do? Because like you just, especially at that time, like people were not at all accustomed to such a thing existing in any respect, let alone seeing it before their eyes. I mean, nowadays we are slightly more scientifically literate, such that we can at least accept that there are people, they're extremely rare, but like there are people that have extreme deformities. But again, it's one thing to read about it, and it's another thing to see it with your own eyes, and it's something that, even if you have tremendous compassion for such people that are afflicted that way, it still is, the human mind has a hard time processing such a thing, because it's just so unlike what we are accustomed to seeing. And I really loved it with the the first scene that made me cry was I think I'd be a great disappointment to her, and she's like, no son as loving as you could ever be a disappointment. And then upon her saying that, she starts crying, but she has to look away because she's trying to hold it together. I mean, because I'm sure this has been just a roller coaster of emotions for her. But like I love that moment on her part, because you can see that she is trying to hold it together. She's trying to be polite and courteous and not stare and all that stuff. But also she's overwhelmed with the fact that he is a very deep well of emotion and love and feeling and all that kind of thing. And yeah, I think, that it just speaks to the film as a whole, that it really is about, when you're confronted with something that unlike anything that most people can even conceive of, that such a thing could exist, such a person could come out that way. It really just begs the question of like, well, how are you going to react? Are you going to be cruel, or are you going to be compassionate? And you see both in tremendous detail.
Actually, I want I was going to say that the contrast that you were saying with the reactions as well, when he would speak to "This is never the way I was," I've never actually had this reaction from a woman before, and there was one time where we got to see the over-the-top scream, which was that comparison when he sent the nurse up there, and that was her initial thing. She did the over-the-top, that loud scream as she moved forward and dropped the plate of everything. And that's a great comparison when you see that and you go to the other, because that's probably what he was greeted with by pretty much any woman that he had seen at the time. So it really does for you.
And keep in mind that, like, we nowadays, we look at that reaction from anybody, let alone a the screaming woman in the horror film cliche. That's so well documented that nowadays it's such a recognizable trope. Except that, well, again, like especially in the beginning of this film, like they do so much build up to revealing the face of the Elephant Man that it clearly, they did their homework as far as like old school horror movies, as far as like how they would build up the reveal of the monster's face. And so that kind of scream evokes that era of horror films. But then, then you think about the fact that, okay, so prior to films and prior to like our oversaturation with the same kinds of things, and the fact that people just photography was still very new, so people didn't really, and there was no internet obviously, so they couldn't look up deformed people or anything. So like when you think of someone screaming like that loudly and that what we would call hysterically, well, at that time it's like, well, I see no reason why not, because again, that's like does not compute, in the human brain. I mean, even today, I think we would say that, let alone back then. Back then, that was essentially like Frankenstein's monster is real and he's standing right in front of you, what do you do? And
that
so
one
it
did give us that moment did give us a little bit, just a bit, for me at least, a little bit of dark humor too, because then you cut to Treves and Gorm in the office, and you see Treves almost roll his eyes like, "Oh, I knew that was coming," and he's like, "I better go see." He just that reaction was it was great. Like he knew it was coming.
And that was really good. Now, see, that actually brings up a good point. So, I generally speaking, I'm someone that, and I'll bring this up when we talk about City Lights. I'm someone that I tend to like movies that blend not just genres but tones, and they kind of have every kind of emotion all in one place. Now, I think with this film, it kind of works in the opposite way, to where it has like pretty much the same kind of tone maintained throughout, but it does it so expertly that it earns every. If you do shed a tear, it's like it earns every single one of them. Like it doesn't rely on manipulative tricks. It just creates that kind of oppressive, melancholic mood all throughout. So that way, when you see him vocalizing his pain, then by that time, just not only has there been buildup, but like the weight of his pain has been pressing down upon you. Like that's how I felt when I watched it. Well, back then and also now, I could literally feel like a weight kind of on my body, and then in those moments where he's conveying his deepest pains, then it's like you feel for him, and I give them a lot of praise for that. And again, that runs often contrary to the kinds of films that tend to be among my favorites, because I think even if your movie is prominently or hurts to, like, if you're making a comedy, it never hurts to have like a dramatic scene or two. If you're making a drama, it doesn't hurt to have a little bit of comic relief in there. But like with this, it's like, yeah, when used appropriately. But like in this case, I think that it
Mhm.
maintained its serious kind of melancholic, kind of somber, but also very hopeful tone. Maintained it well throughout. It was very consistent. The only part that was ever so slightly Mel Brooksy was the guy who puts him through the horrible ordeal with, where he actually shows him his own face for the first time, presumably the first time we ever see it. The first time we ever see that he sees it. He's confronted Anthony Hopkins. He's gonna beat him up, fire him. He's like, only the head mistress or whatever can can fire me, and she bonks him on the head. And
No,
I thought,
only she can sack me, and she I think it was a sack.
yeah, there you go.
Really sucked him.
I did like that.
Well,
And
that was
There's
that was the only part. That was the only part that was like remotely Mel Brooks ish. And I mean, he deliberately didn't want to be credited as a producer because to not lend the perception that it was a comedy. But that was like one moment that I was like, okay, I could see the Mel Brooks on that
or at
moment.
least what you might call old traditional Mel Brooks moment, because I mean, again, we keep talking about Young Frankenstein, and Young Frankenstein beautifully walked the line between parody and pathos. It was not a ribald comedy through and through. It had a lot of drama mixed in, and also I did watch a bonus feature where they went into a lot of depth about it. And yes, Brooks kept his name off the credits. Yeah, that was one thing he did say in the interview. But I believe it was Brooks, if I remember correctly, I believe it was Brooks himself that suggested that they needed to have a slow reveal of Merrick. And I know part of that was necessitated by difficulties with getting the makeup together in time. But I think part of that was he was like, you know what, you should do this slower. And Lynch was like, you know what, you're right.
Well, it makes perfect sense because again, if we're using Frankenstein's monster as a model, they even with James Whale's original film, when Boris Karloff emerged, well, you don't really see much of him for a good while. You only see his hand slowly rise up, and then when he actually enters the room, when he's gotten off the slab, he backs into the room, and then he turns to face Henry Frankenstein, not Victor for some reason. But he turns to face them, and it's very slow. And then they do some like jump cut kind of close ups in on his face. So like sufficient build up, very good reveal, very kind of slow, deliberate. In this case, same philosophy. And even when you do see it the first time, it's at a kind of a long shot, and it's not all that clear. And it's done just right. You don't really get that great of a look at it, even when you do get a little bit of a look at it. And like you said with Young Frankenstein, like there is quite a lot of pathos in there, especially like with Gene Wilder's performance, like just the mania and the sheer conviction that he puts into every word. That could easily have worked, like even if it wasn't like a spoof or whatever, that could have easily worked if they had have done, like if they were intending to like go to do like a full-on homage film, which technically it is that as well. But like the point is, like that fits alongside it so well that when something funny does happen, it makes it all the better. But it just shows that you really can, whatever genre you're doing, you have to undergird it with good, strong, dramatic tension and performances. And so then when if it's comedy, if something funny happens, then that makes it all the better. But yeah, in this case, I think I can't think of anything about the film that I don't like. I mean, I think it's one of those films that all all the elements come together so well. And I the only thing, and it's not the film itself, I'm just more pissed off that it doesn't get talked about anywhere near as much as it should. Like,
Right.
not by, film critics, not by like best of movie lists, not by, again, the Criterion,
I feel
like the
there's
Criterion Collection.
I feel like when I was really going through my phase of
Yeah.
reading a lot of reviews, Elephant Man was mentioned frequently, but you're right, it probably could be more frequently referenced. And it certainly could have done. Yeah, I don't know why Criterion hasn't released it either. But
It's tailor made for it.
Yeah,
If they
Well,
released Armageddon and
There
The
is-
Rock.
right.
One aspect of this film we have not talked about, which is the relationship between captor and captive
Right.
of the anomaly of John Merrick and his original captor.
Lights.
Mike.
Played by Freddie Jones, who does a good job.
Because he's got this enamored obsession with him, and yet he's willing to let him go for a pretty penny, And and the thing is, he thinks of him as his possession, his property.
Yeah.
And that is a very strong emotion and a very strong, even though abusive, relationship, and an interesting one.
Right.
I actually have.
Which there is some question as far as that the real life version of that person, who I think that he had a different
apparently
name,
much
but,
kinder. Yes.
apparently yes, and well, there's different
Tom something or other.
There
Tom
was-
Norman.
there's different accounts of it, and also apparently, like which again they don't go into this detail, but like apparently in the earliest times of Joseph Merrick, once his deformities started to really present themselves, apparently it was his idea to go into the freak show to get some income and earn a living, which, I mean, and they make that point very early on, and it is sad but true. But like at that time, if you had, dwarfism, if you were a Siamese twin, if you had was it gigantism? If you had that, if you had any number of things, then the freak shows were pretty much the only route for you to earn any kind of living or have any kind of camaraderie with other people similar to you in any way. And
Well,
which reminds me, everybody out there who hasn't seen Todd Browning's Freaks needs to see that right now. Those were real life circus freaks.
I almost feel like Bite's relationship with John Merrick, even though it definitely definitely was hate of him as a creature. But I almost wonder if it borderlined on a kind of fatherly kind of a love too, like a caretaker kind of a love too, because even though he was very selfish, he wanted to know what went on with him between the scientist and what was going on. He wanted to be in on, what was going on. And yet,
with a lot of I mean, his feeling like he owns him, I mean, that obviously evokes slavery,
Right.
And in effect it kind of was like that. But then also, like, with his with a lot of, like, let's say abusive parents, you'll find that it isn't necessarily all cruelty all the time, that you may is where they care enough about the child in their care enough to where they want to know what's going on, but it's also insofar as they can control that person. And I think in this respect it's kind of that way. It's like an attempt at love, but it's like a completely
Very
wrong, destructive
warped,
version of it.
yeah, warped version.
Definitely that
Absolutely.
evolved when he involved the worker of the hospital in his kidnapping later on.
And I do want to
Mhm.
mention real quick. You're talking about the dwarfism and whatever being with the freak shows. When he gets broken out from the place at the end or near the end, that head dwarf looked awful familiar to me, and of course that was Kenny Baker, who has had a lot of good. He was in Time Bandits and Labyrinth and Willow and Flash Gordon
And he was
R2D2.
R2D2.
Yes, so that was a fascinating thing.
Interesting enough.
Oh yeah.
Enough.
And I wanted to. What's up?
Christopher Tucker was one of the makeup guys on Elephant Man, and he worked specifically on Star Wars. There's another Star Wars connection here where he did a lot of the makeup for the cantina scene that you see in the original Star Wars. So that I thought was unique, and hearing that there were two Star Wars connections.
Right.
Well, and plus Star Wars being principally produced at Elstree Studios in England, so let's not forget that.
Plus, and I got Spaceballs connection with Mel Brooks. So,
well, and not just Mel Brooks, but of course John Hurt had that cameo in Spaceballs, where he was essentially reprising the role, I think, from Aliens or whatever it was. Yeah, that was kind of an interesting little bit. But I wanted to mention two others. We talked briefly about Mother's Head, who's the headmistress of the hospital. And she is played by Wendy Hiller, who's a veteran actress of much talent. And she did a great job with that role. I think it was she did a good job doing the no nonsense. Like you said, she had that one really comedic moment, but mostly she just was like the no nonsense, like she kept the doctor in line kind of character. And I thought she did a good job there. But
she had a really standout scene where she's telling Anthony Hopkins that she, essentially, washed him, she dressed him, she did a lot more than anybody else would do, and even though she wasn't like the nicest or the most like cheery about it, I mean, she did. She was more like the if you know the five love languages. One of them is acts of service, and she clearly is operating under that kind of frame of mind, and so like she has that great scene where she kind of tells him off a little bit, and that was a standout.
I believe what she said was something like, "If you ask me, he's just being stared at all over again," something like that. And it was like she really took the task with that.
Yeah, she had a lot of courage and a lot of tenacity,
Right. And the other one that fascinated me was Bite's boy, the guy, his caretaker's boy. I was a very young Dexter Fletcher, who would go on to have a fascinating filmography as an actor, including Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels, Topsy Turvy, Band of Brothers, Layer Cake, Kick-Ass, but then notably Muppets Most Wanted, I know your favorite movie ever, but then notably went on to direct Eddie the Eagle, Rocket Man, and to take over for the mess left behind Bryan Singer on Bohemian Rhapsody. So I just fascinated, like this is the very beginning of the career of a future director.
That's pretty sweet.
Yeah,
and he learning from some of the best in the biz.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, does anybody have anything else to add as we, I think, kind of wrap it up here?
Well, I should say one thing on the makeup, which is that they had such a compressed time frame, but they were actually granted the opportunity to use the actual life mold of Merrick's head to do the makeup, which is pretty cool that the hospital actually was willing to let them do that. But
oh yeah, I mean that's kind of unprecedented, but it also, then again, the real guy was kind of unprecedented too. So I mean, I'm really thankful though that they did that,
Mhm.
because the
Mhm.
makeup, if you look at the two side by side, it's a very, very close recreation. And it's quite astounding. I mean, the makeup
Did,
job is a
Mhm.
work of art in and of itself,
did
let
anyone
alone what. Go
David
ahead.
Lynch as the man in the bowler hat and the mob chasing Merrick?
I know he was credited for that, but I didn't notice him. Of course, he was a lot younger then. He didn't have that crazy
Yeah.
hair he does now.
Yeah, I would need to look at what he looked like when he was younger versus now, because like
I saw
nowadays
some stills.
he's pretty he's pretty recognizable, but like back then I don't know. I mean, there are a lot of directors who you would recognize him easily today, but if you were to see him back then, you wouldn't necessarily put two and two together.
Right. The another point that I
Hey,
want to make sure that I
leading into our Chaplin discussion, one of the people that was involved in the makeup section of this film was actually a part of the makeup department in the movie Chaplin in 1992, as well as the Guns of Navarone, and the Dirty Dozen, and Fiddler on the Roof, and that would be Wally Schneiderman. So I thought that was kind of interesting.
I need to
That
revisit
is
Chaplin.
interesting.
That was a good movie, and I need to watch my copy of Fiddler on the Roof.
Oh,
But I did want to make one other connection to City Lights, and Dane, I'm sure you probably had some comments on the Chaplin side of this, so I'll leave that for that discussion. But one thing they have in common was that they both did stuff that should have, conventional wisdom, should have failed. Uh, but they insisted on it. And in this case, I understand that Brooks insisted that they film on black and white stock, which was very, very, very strange for that time.
Well,
So,
and boy, oh boy, do the results show on the screen. I mean,
right.
every time that I see a black and white film in an era that it wasn't commonly known for being in black and white, like even something as recent as The Lighthouse, which that one was also black and white and in 4:3. So like when I see something like that, it's like, oh, instant 50 points right there.
Or like last week, I revisited Alexander Payne's Nebraska, which is
excellent movie, shot in black and white, and then when it starts, old Paramount logo, and I was like, okay, plus 50 points for the old logo, plus 50 points for the black and white. This is starting off on a good note.
Yes.
Well, shall we give our spiels?
Okay.
Why don't you go first, Jake?
Okay. I'm Kotobuki Jake, and I am a movie fan and collector, and am the co-host on Septum Sin versus the World on YouTube, and also will eventually be revamped and updated YouTube nature theme channel, Kotobuki Jake. And of course, I frequently guest on this discussion group as well as Inside Movies Galore, which good discussion coming up soon. So
yes.
Yes.
David.
Well, my name is David Strege. I am one of the founding fathers of Inside Movies Galore, which will be joining shortly for a very interesting Chaplin discussion. And but I also moonlight under a different channel called Delusions of Grandeur, where I review films and I post video pickup videos. So definitely check out some of the reviews and interviews that I had on either one of these channels. So thank you for joining us on this journey of meeting our very lovely introducer to this film, Dane.
Yes, and
Mhm.
Brandon.
Septum Sen of Septum Sen versus the World. You can look up more online.
Awesome. And I'm Dane Kyle, aka Dane Damarung on YouTube, and my channel is Indie Horror Film Creative, where I do a show called Blu-ray Views, where I unbox some new pickups I've gotten and do some reviews, and gonna be expanding that channel in the future. And very glad to have talked about this film. Stay tuned on Inside Movies Galore coming up next, where we talk about my number one favorite film of all time, City Lights by Charlie Chaplin. So please stay tuned, ladies and gentlemen.
All right.